December 31st, 1958. The Hotel Riviera, Havana, Cuba. 11:47 p.m. Meyer Lansky stands on the penthouse balcony of the casino he built, watching fireworks explode over the Malecon. Below him, thousands of Cubans celebrate New Year's Eve in the streets of a city that has become the most profitable gambling destination in the Western Hemisphere. The air smells of salt water, expensive perfume, and cigar smoke. Music pulses from every nightclub, every casino, every bar along the waterfront. American tourists crowd the roulette tables 15 floors below, losing money with the cheerful recklessness of people on vacation who believe the party will never end. Lansky is 66 years old, impeccably dressed in a white dinner jacket, a Cuban cigar in his left hand, a tumbler of scotch in his right. He has spent a decade building this empire: hotels, casinos, nightclubs, transforming Havana into a tropical Las Vegas, a paradise where Americans can gamble, drink, and indulge appetites forbidden at home. He has invested tens of millions of dollars, his own money and money from mafia families across America. He has cultivated relationships with Cuban President Fulgencio Batista, who receives a percentage of every dollar that flows through mob-controlled casinos. He has created a machine that generates millions in annual profits. This is the peak of his power. The Riviera cost $14 million to build, the most expensive hotel casino in Latin America. The National, the Capri, the Deauville, the Sevilla Biltmore, all mob-controlled, all printing money. Lansky personally oversees the skim, the systematic theft of casino revenue before it is officially counted and taxed. The skim flows to mafia families in New York, Chicago, Miami, and Tampa, enriching bosses who have entrusted Lansky with their investments. But at this moment, watching fireworks over Havana Bay, Meyer Lansky does not know that his empire has approximately 13 hours left. At 1 a.m. on January 1st, 1959, word reaches the Riviera that President Batista has fled Cuba. He has boarded a plane to the Dominican Republic with his family and suitcases full of cash. The government has collapsed. Fidel Castro's rebel army is marching toward Havana. The revolution has won. Within weeks, Castro's forces will seize every casino, every hotel, every gambling operation in Cuba. Lansky himself will be imprisoned briefly before being deported. The American mob's Cuban operation, the most sophisticated, most profitable criminal enterprise they ever built, will vanish. Tens of millions of dollars in investments will be lost. An empire constructed over 15 years through violence, corruption, and business acumen will be destroyed in days. This is the story of how the Mafia built paradise in Havana, how they ruled it like kings, and how they lost everything when history turned against them. It is a story of ambition and greed, of brilliance and brutality, of an empire that seemed permanent until the night it simply ended. The Mafia's interest in Cuba begins not with casinos, but with proximity and prohibition. 90 miles separate Key West from Havana, close enough that rum runners can transport Cuban liquor to Florida in a few hours, far enough that U.S. law enforcement cannot easily pursue them. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, mobsters used Cuba as a transshipment point for alcohol smuggled into the United States. They established relationships with Cuban officials, learning that the island operates on a simple principle: everything is for sale if the price is right. The repeal of Prohibition in December 1933 eliminates the bootlegging trade, but the mobsters remember Cuba's advantages: corrupt government, proximity to the United States, tropical climate that attracts tourists, and a culture of casual illegality where gambling and prostitution flourish with minimal official interference. Some mobsters begin exploring whether Cuba might support more ambitious operations than simple smuggling. The dominant figure in this early period is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the New York boss who reorganized Italian-American organized crime in the 1930s, transforming it from chaotic ethnic gangs into structured families operating under commission authority. Luciano recognizes Cuba's potential, but is too occupied with domestic operations to exploit it immediately. That changes in 1936 when he is convicted on compulsory prostitution charges and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano serves 9 years before being released in 1946 as a reward for allegedly assisting U.S. military intelligence during World War II. The details of this assistance remain murky. Luciano claimed he helped prevent sabotage on New York docks, though evidence is thin. His release comes with conditions. He must leave the United States immediately and never return. Italy, his birthplace, refuses him entry initially. Luciano chooses Cuba as his exile destination. He arrives in Havana in October 1946, checking into the Hotel Nacional under a false name. Within weeks, word spreads through the American underworld. Luciano is in Cuba and conducting business. He is not hiding. He is hosting meetings, settling disputes, making decisions that affect organized crime throughout the United States. He has found a location 90 miles from America, where he can operate beyond U.S. jurisdiction, while remaining close enough to maintain control of his interests. In December 1946, Luciano hosts what becomes known as the Havana Conference, a gathering of major mafia bosses from across America. The attendees include Meyer Lansky from New York, Santo Trafficante Jr. from Tampa, Carlos Marcello from New Orleans, Joseph Bonanno from New York, and representatives from families in Chicago, Detroit, and other cities. They meet at the Hotel Nacional, conducting business in suites and conference rooms, discussing territorial disputes, narcotics trafficking policy, and investment opportunities. The Havana Conference demonstrates Cuba's appeal to organized crime. The island offers a neutral ground where bosses from different families can meet without fearing law enforcement surveillance or territorial conflicts. Cuban officials do not interfere. They are paid not to notice. The climate is pleasant. The hotels are comfortable. Everything the mobsters need, women, liquor, entertainment, is readily available. But the Havana Conference also attracts unwanted attention. U.S. authorities learn of Luciano's presence in Cuba. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, pressures the Cuban government to deport him. Anslinger argues that Luciano is using Cuba as a base for heroin trafficking into the United States. In February 1947, Cuban authorities arrest Luciano and place him on a ship to Italy. His Cuban exile has lasted 4 months. Luciano's deportation is a setback, but the Havana Conference has proven that Cuba can serve organized crime's interests. The mobsters have observed Cuban corruption firsthand. They have seen the island's tourist potential. They have recognized that legal gambling, which Cuba permits under certain circumstances, could generate enormous profits if properly organized. They begin planning more systematic exploitation of Cuban opportunities. The man who will architect this exploitation is Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky is born Meyer Sucholyansky in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, in 1902. His family immigrates to New York in 1911, settling on the Lower East Side. Young Meyer grows up in poverty, in tenements crowded with Jewish immigrants who fled pogroms and persecution. He is intelligent, mathematical, and utterly ruthless. By his teenage years, he is running dice games and providing muscle for local criminals. Lansky's genius is financial, rather than violent. While other mobsters are skilled at intimidation and murder, Lansky understands bookkeeping, money laundering, and the mechanics of extracting maximum profit from illegal enterprises. He recognizes early that sustainable criminal operations require accounting as much as enforcement. He develops methods for skimming casino revenue, for hiding profits through shell companies, for moving money through banks in ways that obscure its criminal origins. During Prohibition, Lansky partners with Charles Luciano and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, forming a criminal enterprise that dominates bootlegging in New York. When Prohibition ends, Lansky shifts to illegal gambling. He operates casinos in Florida, New York, and New Orleans. He becomes the Mafia's premier gambling expert, the man who understands odds, house advantages, and casino management better than anyone else in organized crime. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Lansky makes exploratory visits to Cuba, assessing its potential for gambling operations. He meets with Cuban officials, determining what permissions can be purchased and at what price. He studies Havana's existing casinos, which are small, poorly managed operations that cater primarily to locals and generate minimal revenue. He recognizes that Cuba could support something far more ambitious: large-scale casinos designed to attract wealthy American tourists, operated with Las Vegas-style professionalism, integrated into luxury hotels that provide complete vacation experiences. But exploiting this potential requires political stability and government cooperation. Cuba in the 1940s has neither. The government is unstable, with presidents elected through fraud and corruption, then overthrown in coups. Officials demand bribes but cannot guarantee protection. The business environment is too chaotic for the kind of massive investments Lansky envisions. Everything changes in March 1952 when Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a military coup. Batista has governed Cuba before. He was president from 1940 to 1944, and he understands how the system works. He is corrupt, authoritarian, and pragmatic. He recognizes that Cuba's economy depends on tourism, that tourism requires attractions, and that American tourists love gambling. He is willing to legalize and regulate casinos if doing so generates revenue for his government and his personal bank accounts. Lansky approaches Batista within weeks of the coup. The meeting occurs at the presidential palace in Havana. Lansky proposes a partnership. He will invest in building luxury hotel casinos that will transform Havana into the Caribbean's premier destination. In exchange, Batista will provide casino licenses, will ensure police protection, and will establish favorable regulations. Most importantly, Batista will receive a percentage of casino revenues, not officially, but through arrangements that allow him to profit handsomely from mob investments. Batista agrees. He issues decree laws that legalize casino gambling in hotels of a certain size and quality, effectively ensuring that only major investors, not small local operators, can obtain licenses. He establishes the Cuban Tourist Commission, which he controls, as the authority that approves casino applications. He creates a regulatory framework that appears legitimate while giving himself complete discretion over who receives licenses. The deal is set. Lansky has secured government blessing for the most ambitious organized crime operation in history. Now he needs capital. Financing Havana's casino empire requires convincing multiple mafia families to invest. Lansky cannot fund the operations alone. He needs tens of millions of dollars to build hotels and casinos that will meet Batista's requirements and attract affluent American tourists. He must persuade skeptical bosses that Cuba represents a sound investment despite its political instability and distance from traditional mob territories. Lansky's pitch emphasizes several advantages. First, Cuban casinos are legal, eliminating the law enforcement risks that plague illegal gambling in the United States. Second, Cuba's proximity to Florida means easy access for American tourists. Direct flights from Miami take 45 minutes. Third, Batista's government is stable, for now, and cooperating fully. Fourth, and most compellingly, the potential profits are enormous. Lansky projects that properly managed casinos in Havana could generate millions of dollars annually in skim, untaxed, unreported profits stolen before revenue is officially counted. The bosses are intrigued but cautious. They demand guarantees that Batista will protect their investments, that casino operations will be profitable, that Cuban partners will not cheat them. Lansky provides these guarantees through his own participation. He announces he will personally invest in and manage several casinos, putting his own money at risk. This commitment reassures the bosses. If Meyer Lansky believes in Cuba, they reason, then Cuba must be legitimate. Between 1952 and 1958, organized crime invests more than $50 million in Havana hotel casinos. The largest projects include the Hotel Nacional, 1955. The National already exists. It was built in 1930 and is Havana's most prestigious hotel. Lansky negotiates with its owners to install and operate a casino. He completely renovates the gambling floor, importing equipment from Las Vegas, training Cuban dealers according to American standards, and establishing management systems that ensure the skim operates efficiently. The National Casino opens in October 1955 and immediately becomes the most profitable gambling operation in Cuba. The Hotel Riviera, 1957. This is Lansky's masterpiece, a $14 million hotel casino designed to rival anything in Las Vegas. The Riviera towers 21 stories above the Malecon, Havana's oceanfront boulevard. It contains 352 guest rooms, multiple restaurants, a massive swimming pool, a Copa Room showroom featuring American entertainers, and a casino with roulette, craps, blackjack, and slot machines. The architecture is modernist, the furnishings are luxurious, and the casino floor is designed using principles Lansky learned from decades of gambling operations. Good sight lines for surveillance, strategic placement of high-stakes tables, lighting and decor that encourage extended play. The Riviera opens on December 10, 1957. Opening night features performances by Ginger Rogers and other celebrities. Cuban high society attends. American tourists fly in from Miami. The casino floor is packed. Within months, the Riviera is generating more than $3 million annually in reported revenue, and several times that amount in skim. The Hotel Capri, 1957. This hotel is controlled by Santo Traficante Jr., the Tampa mob boss who has been operating in Cuba since the 1940s. Traficante invests $2 million in the Capri, a 14-story hotel with a rooftop casino. The Capri caters to slightly less affluent tourists than the Riviera, offering lower table minimums and cheaper rooms. Actor George Raft, who played gangsters in numerous Hollywood films, serves as the casino's greeter, adding celebrity appeal. The Capri is profitable but less spectacular than Lansky's operations. The Hotel Deauville, 1957. Another Lansky project, smaller than the Riviera but still substantial. The Deauville features a casino, nightclub, and restaurant. Like all Lansky operations, it is managed professionally, with careful attention to customer service, game integrity, no cheating. Lansky understands that honest games with proper house advantages generate more profit than rigged games that drive customers away. And security. The Havana Hilton, 1958. The largest hotel in Latin America at the time of completion. The Hilton chain builds it with Cuban government financing, but Lansky negotiates to operate the casino. The Hilton is intended as the crown jewel of Cuban tourism. 630 rooms, multiple restaurants, a shopping arcade, and a massive casino. It opens in March 1958, just 10 months before everything collapses. These projects transform Havana. The city becomes synonymous with glamour, excitement, and barely legal indulgence. American magazines publish articles describing Havana as the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. Travel agencies promote package tours, airfare from Miami, 3 nights at a Havana casino hotel, meals and entertainment included, all for less than a week's vacation in Miami Beach. Celebrities visit. Frank Sinatra performs at the Riviera, Ernest Hemingway drinks at the bars, American politicians vacation at the hotels. But beneath the glamour is violence and exploitation. The Batista regime is authoritarian and brutal. Political opponents are imprisoned, tortured, and murdered. Corruption is endemic. Government officials demand bribes for every service. Police extract payments from businesses. Military officers steal from public funds. Most Cubans live in poverty, while the elite class, enriched by American investment and mob profits, lives luxuriously. The casinos employ thousands of Cubans, but the good jobs, dealers, pit bosses, management, go to Americans brought in by the mob. Cubans work as waiters, janitors, and busboys, earning minimal wages while watching Americans gamble away sums that exceed a Cuban worker's annual income. Prostitution flourishes, with thousands of Cuban women selling themselves to American tourists. The mob controls many of the brothels, taking a percentage of every transaction. This inequality breeds resentment. In the mountains of eastern Cuba, a revolutionary movement is growing. A young lawyer named Fidel Castro has been organizing guerrilla forces since 1956, attacking military outposts, sabotaging infrastructure, and gaining support from peasants and workers who despise Batista's regime. The revolutionaries explicitly target American economic interests, viewing them as collaborators in Batista's oppression. The mob dismisses Castro as a minor threat. Batista's military is well-equipped and supposedly loyal. The revolutionaries are outnumbered and operating from remote mountains. Every previous Cuban revolution has eventually been crushed or co-opted. The casinos continue operating, the tourists continue arriving, and the money continues flowing. Meyer Lansky believes his empire is secure. He is catastrophically wrong. The first direct attack on mob interests occurs on March 13, 1957. Revolutionary students from the Directorio Revolucionario assault the presidential palace, attempting to assassinate Batista. The attack fails, Batista escapes to the third floor and the attackers are killed or captured. But it demonstrates that armed opposition to the regime is willing to strike at the heart of Havana, not just in distant mountains. The mob interprets this attack as confirmation that security is necessary. Lansky increases the number of armed guards at casinos. He ensures that management and dealers are aware of evacuation procedures. He maintains close contact with Batista's government, receiving assurances that the regime is stable and that revolutionaries will not be allowed to threaten tourist areas. But the assurances are increasingly hollow. Throughout 1957 and 1958, Castro's forces gain strength. They win small victories against Batista's military. They conduct propaganda campaigns, portraying themselves as liberators fighting against a corrupt dictatorship. International media begins covering the revolution sympathetically, describing Castro as a romantic rebel fighting oppression, rather than a communist seeking power. The mob notices declining tourist numbers in late 1958. Americans are reading newspaper accounts of bombings in Havana, of rebel activity near tourist areas, of instability in Batista's government. Some tourists cancel reservations. Airlines report declining bookings. The casinos remain profitable, but the trajectory is concerning. More alarming are the direct threats. In October 1958, rebels bomb several Havana businesses with American connections. In November, they issue statements declaring that any Cuban who works for American interests is a collaborator who will face revolutionary justice. In December, rebel forces advanced toward Havana, winning battles that should have been easy victories for Batista's superior military. Batista's military is collapsing not through defeat, but through demoralization. Soldiers are deserting. Officers are refusing to fight. Commanders are preparing to flee. The regime that seemed permanent just months ago is disintegrating. And still the mob continues operating, believing that whatever government emerges will want to maintain the tourist economy, will recognize that casinos generate revenue, will be willing to continue the arrangements that Batista established. This belief is delusional, but delusion is easier than accepting that everything, the investments, the relationships, the decade of work, is about to be lost. December 28, 1958. The Sans Souci Casino, Havana, 11:30 p.m. The casino is crowded with American tourists who have decided that political instability makes for exciting vacation stories. They play roulette, craps, blackjack, seemingly unconcerned that revolutionary forces are advancing on the capital. The atmosphere is surreal. Champagne flows, dealers call bets in English and Spanish, slot machines ring and flash, while outside the city waits for news of its fate. Santo Traficante Jr. is present, moving between tables, observing operations. He has spent years building his Cuban empire, the Capri Hotel, interests in several other casinos, relationships with Cuban officials. He has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars. He stands to lose everything if the revolution succeeds. At midnight, word spreads through the casino. Batista has scheduled an emergency meeting with military commanders and key supporters. The meeting is set for tomorrow, December 29th, at the presidential palace. Speculation intensifies. Is Batista planning a final military offensive? Is he negotiating with revolutionaries? Is he preparing to flee? The tourists continue gambling, oblivious or uncaring. But the mob operators understand. They begin making contingency plans, transferring money out of Cuba, arranging escape routes, considering whether to shut down operations or maintain them until the situation clarifies. Most decide to continue operating. Closing casinos would signal panic, might trigger runs on banks, could become self-fulfilling prophecy if tourists conclude Havana is unsafe. December 31st, 1958. The final night. The casinos are packed. New Year's Eve in Havana has always been spectacular. Fireworks, parties, excess on a scale that Americans cannot experience at home. This year is no different, at least on the surface. The Riviera's Copa Room features a special show. The National hosts a gala dinner. The Capri's rooftop casino offers views of fireworks over the bay. American tourists celebrate, drink, gamble, apparently unconcerned that the country around them is collapsing. Meyer Lansky is at the Riviera, as described in the opening. He watches fireworks from his penthouse balcony. He has spent the day in meetings with Cuban officials, seeking assurances about security, stability, the government's plans. The assurances have been vague and unconvincing, but Lansky remains, refusing to abandon the empire he built. Shortly after 1 a.m. on January 1, 1959, Lansky receives a phone call. The message is brief. Batista has fled. He boarded a plane at Camp Columbia Military Airfield around 2 a.m. with his family, close associates, and as much cash as they could carry, estimated at more than $40 million stolen from the Cuban treasury. He is gone. The government has collapsed. Cuba has no president, no functioning administration, no authority. Lansky stands on the balcony holding the phone, watching the fireworks continue. Below him, thousands of people celebrate, unaware that everything has changed. The tourists in the casino are still gambling. The dealers are still calling bets. The slot machines are still ringing, but the empire is finished. He knows this with absolute certainty. Without Batista, without government protection, without the corruption that made everything possible, the casinos cannot survive. By dawn on January 1st, news of Batista's flight has spread. Crowds pour into the streets of Havana, not celebrating the new year, but celebrating the revolution's victory. They attack symbols of the old regime, police stations, government buildings, businesses associated with Batista. They target the casinos. The attacks begin at the National. A mob breaks through the doors, smashing slot machines, overturning roulette tables, destroying furniture. They are not stealing. They are destroying, expressing rage at institutions that symbolize American exploitation and Cuban humiliation. Security guards flee. Hotel staff evacuate guests to their rooms. The casino floor is demolished within hours. Similar attacks occur at other casinos. The Capri is ransacked. The Deauville is damaged. The Sans Souci is burned. Only the Riviera and Hilton are spared significant damage, possibly because their size and security prevent mobs from entering easily. But the message is clear. The casinos are targets, symbols of corruption that must be eliminated. The mob operators evacuate. Santo Traficante attempts to leave Havana on January 2nd but is arrested at the airport. Cuban authorities, unsure what to do with American mobsters, detain him for weeks before eventually deporting him. Meyer Lansky remains in Cuba slightly longer, attempting to salvage something, money, equipment, anything. But there is nothing to salvage. On January 8th, Fidel Castro enters Havana in triumph. One of his first acts is declaring all casinos closed pending review. The review is a formality. Castro's government announces that gambling is forbidden, that casinos are instruments of capitalist exploitation, that Cuba will no longer be a playground for wealthy Americans while Cubans suffer in poverty. The casinos are seized, their assets nationalized, their operators expelled. Some casinos are converted to other uses. Others are simply abandoned, left to decay, monuments to an empire that existed for less than a decade before vanishing overnight. Meyer Lansky leaves Cuba in late January 1959. He returns to Miami, having lost tens of millions of dollars in investments. The other mob families have also suffered catastrophic losses. The Riviera alone cost $14 million, money that will never be recovered. The casinos that were generating millions in annual skim are gone. The relationships with Cuban officials are worthless. The decade of work, the corruption, the planning, all of it is lost. Initially, the mob believes this is temporary. Revolutions, they reason, are chaotic but eventually stabilize. Whatever government emerges will recognize that tourism generates revenue, that casinos attract tourists, that American investment benefits Cuba. The mob maintains contacts in Cuba, waiting for opportunities to re-establish operations. These hopes are delusional. Castro's government is ideologically opposed to gambling, viewing it as immoral and exploitative. Moreover, relations between Cuba and the United States deteriorate rapidly. Castro nationalizes American-owned property, not just casinos but sugar plantations, oil refineries, factories worth billions of dollars. The U.S. government imposes economic sanctions. Castro aligns with the Soviet Union. By 1961, the two nations have severed diplomatic relations and are essentially enemies. The mob attempts various schemes to regain Cuban operations. Some involve supporting anti-Castro Cuban exiles, providing funding and weapons for attempted invasions. Others involve approaching CIA officials with proposals to assassinate Castro, with the logic that a new Cuban government might restore casinos. These schemes are fantasies born of desperation. The CIA does recruit mobsters for some assassination plots against Castro. Santos Traficante and Johnny Roselli are allegedly involved, but the plots fail and casinos are never restored. The mob's Cuban empire is permanently gone. The lost investments are catastrophic, but the strategic impact is even more significant. The mob had viewed Cuba as a model for international operations. Find a corrupt government willing to legalize and protect gambling, build infrastructure that attracts tourists, establish professional operations that generate massive skim. The Cuban collapse demonstrates that this model depends on political stability. When governments fall, investments vanish. The risk is unacceptable for similar ventures in other Caribbean or Latin American nations. Instead, the mob refocuses on Las Vegas, which is emerging as America's gambling capital. The irony is bitter. While Lansky was building Havana, other mobsters were building Las Vegas casinos using similar techniques. Las Vegas casinos operate under Nevada state licensing, with far more regulatory oversight than Cuba ever had, but they are still enormously profitable and more secure from political upheaval. The lesson is clear: operate in stable environments, even if regulations are stricter, rather than unstable environments with minimal regulations. For Meyer Lansky personally, the Cuban disaster is devastating. He is 67 years old when the empire collapses. He has lost a fortune. He will spend his remaining years fighting legal battles, evading prosecution, and attempting to recover assets hidden in Swiss banks and shell companies. He dies in 1983 at age 81, having outlived most of his mob contemporaries, but never recovering the wealth and power he possessed in 1958. Santo Traficante Jr. returns to Tampa and refocuses on domestic operations. He survives the Cuban disaster better than most because his investments were smaller than Lansky's. He remains a significant mob figure through the 1970s and early 1980s, dying of natural causes in 1987. He never speaks publicly about Cuba, maintaining silence about the years when he believed he was building a permanent empire. The Cuban government maintains the hotels, the Riviera, the National, the Capri, as tourist attractions, but without casinos. They are operated by Cuban state tourism agencies, generating minimal revenue compared to mob operations. The buildings themselves become relics, preserved but fading, reminders of an era when Havana was the most glamorous city in the Caribbean. Behind the financial losses and strategic failures are thousands of individual tragedies. The Cuban employees who worked in casinos lose their jobs when gambling is outlawed. Many are suspected of collaboration with Americans and face persecution from revolutionary authorities. Some are imprisoned. Others flee to Miami, joining the Cuban exile community that will spend decades hoping to return. The prostitutes who serviced American tourists face particularly harsh treatment. Castro's government views prostitution as evidence of capitalist degradation. Women who worked in brothels or solicited independently are sent to rehabilitation camps, where they are taught proper revolutionary values and forced into agricultural or factory labor. Their lives, already desperate under Batista, become even worse under the revolution that claimed to liberate them. The ordinary Cubans who gambled in casinos, there were some though most patrons were American tourists, lose access to entertainment that provided escape from poverty. The revolutionaries portray this as liberation from vice, but for many Cubans, the casinos represented possibility, however illusory. A clerk earning $20 weekly might bet $1 on roulette, dreaming of the jackpot that could transform his life. The revolution eliminates this dream along with the casinos, replacing it with socialist rhetoric about collective prosperity that for most Cubans remains perpetually unrealized. The American tourists who visited Havana casinos are largely unaffected. They return to the United States with stories about their close brush with revolution. Some lose money they left in casino cages or hotel safes when properties are seized. But these losses are trivial compared to what Cuban employees and mob investors lose. The Cuban exile community in Miami preserves memories of pre-revolutionary Havana with nostalgia that borders on fantasy. They describe a golden age when Havana was beautiful, prosperous, and free, conveniently forgetting Batista's authoritarianism, the poverty that afflicted most Cubans, the exploitation that underlay the tourism economy. For exiles, the casinos become symbols not of mob greed, but of a lost world when Cuba was connected to America, when opportunity existed, when the future seemed bright. This nostalgia obscures reality. The Havana that Lansky and the mob built was never sustainable. It was an empire constructed on corruption, violence, and economic exploitation. It enriched a tiny elite, mobsters Batista and his cronies, a few Cuban business owners, while the majority of Cubans remained poor. The casinos employed thousands, but at wages that barely sustained life, while American tourists gambled away fortunes. The hotels were magnificent, but ordinary Cubans could not afford to enter them except as employees. The revolution that destroyed the casinos was itself deeply flawed. Castro's government proved authoritarian, economically incompetent, and repressive. For many Cubans, life after the revolution was harder than before. But the mob's Cuban empire deserved to fall. It was built on injustice and maintained through corruption. Its collapse was inevitable, not because of Castro specifically, but because systems built on such foundations cannot endure. History offers a tantalizing counterfactual. What if Batista had not fled? What if his military had remained loyal? What if the revolution had been crushed? In this alternate timeline, the casinos continue operating. The mob's investments are secure. Havana remains America's tropical playground, perhaps becoming even larger and more profitable through the 1960s and 1970s. Las Vegas might never achieve its dominance if Havana remains a viable alternative. The mob continues operating internationally, building casinos in other Caribbean nations, perhaps expanding to Central America or South America. But this counterfactual requires ignoring Cuban reality. Batista's regime was unsustainable regardless of whether Castro succeeded. The corruption, the inequality, the repression, these factors would eventually produce revolution even if Castro had never existed. Another leader would have emerged. Another movement would have mobilized the peasants and workers. The casinos might have survived longer, but they could not have survived permanently in a system so fundamentally unjust. Moreover, the mob's Cuban empire faced challenges beyond political instability. The scheme that made Havana so profitable required corruption at every level. Casino management, government officials, American authorities who ignored money laundering. As federal law enforcement became more aggressive in investigating organized crime during the 1960s, maintaining this corruption would have become increasingly difficult. The FBI's Top Hoodlum program, launched after the Appalachian meeting in 1957, targeted mob operations across America. Cuban casinos would eventually have attracted similar scrutiny. The counterfactual also ignores changing American attitudes toward Cuba. Even before Castro, many Americans viewed Cuba as a den of vice, a place for gambling, prostitution, and activities shameful at home. This perception generated moral opposition to American investments in Cuban casinos. If Batista had remained in power, this opposition might have intensified, potentially leading to U.S. government pressure to end mob operations, even without revolution. So the counterfactual is fantasy. The mob's Cuban empire was always temporary, a bubble inflated by unique circumstances, Batista's corruption, Americans' appetite for gambling, the brief window before revolution, that could not last. The only question was when it would collapse, not whether. More than 60 years after the revolution, the physical remnants of the mob's Cuban empire remain. The Hotel Nacional still operates, a grand dame of Caribbean hospitality that trades on nostalgia for Havana's glamorous past. Tourists can visit the rooms where mobsters stayed, the locations where deals were struck. The hotel maintains a small museum displaying photographs from the 1950s, Meyer Lansky at a casino table, Santo Traficante smoking a cigar, American celebrities performing in the Copa room. The Riviera operated as a hotel until 2016, when deterioration forced its closure. It now sits empty, a 21-story monument to a vanished era. The modernist architecture, once cutting-edge, now appears dated. The windows are broken. The swimming pool is drained. Occasional proposals emerge to renovate and reopen it, but funding never materializes. The Riviera is caught in limbo, too historically significant to demolish, too expensive to restore. The Capri was renovated and reopened in the 2000s as a boutique hotel. It trades on its mob history, advertising itself as the place where Santo Trafficante operated and George Raft greeted guests. Tourists can stay in rooms that once housed mobsters, though the casino is gone and the rooftop bar offers cocktails instead of craps tables. These preserved buildings serve a Cuban government narrative that is equal parts history and propaganda. The narrative acknowledges that American mobsters operated in pre-revolutionary Havana, but portrays them as colonialist exploiters whose departure was necessary for Cuban dignity. The casinos are described as symbols of American imperialism, evidence that capitalism corrupts and degrades. This narrative is partially true, but incomplete. Yes, the mob exploited Cuba. Yes, the casinos enriched Americans while most Cubans remained poor. But the Cuban government's narrative ignores its own subsequent failures: the authoritarianism, the economic stagnation, the reality that many Cubans today live in worse conditions than their grandparents did in the 1950s. The mob's empire was unjust, but what replaced it was not the liberation promised by revolution. In the United States, the Cuban disaster becomes a cautionary tale within organized crime. Bosses who lost money in Havana warn younger members about international investments, about trusting foreign governments, about believing that any criminal empire is permanent. The lesson: operate domestically, in jurisdictions where you understand the political system, where corruption is stable, where investments can be somewhat protected. This caution shapes organized crime's development through the 1960s and beyond. While the mob continues operating in Las Vegas, it becomes more risk-averse about expansion. Proposals to build casino operations in the Bahamas, Haiti, or other Caribbean nations are evaluated skeptically. The memory of Cuba, the millions lost, the suddenness of collapse, haunts every discussion of international expansion. The Cuban disaster also influences U.S. government policy toward the mob. Federal authorities recognize that organized crime operates internationally, that domestic prosecutions alone cannot eliminate mob power. This recognition leads to increased cooperation with foreign law enforcement, to treaties that facilitate extradition and asset seizure, to efforts to deny the mob safe havens abroad. The Cuban experience demonstrates that the mob will exploit any corrupt regime willing to host them, so eliminating those opportunities becomes a policy priority. Meyer Lansky lives 24 years after losing Cuba. He continues operating from Miami, managing mob investments in Las Vegas, attempting to establish casino operations in the Bahamas. The project fails, and fighting legal battles with federal prosecutors who pursue him for tax evasion and other crimes. He is indicted multiple times but convicted only once, receiving a brief prison sentence in his 70s. He develops heart disease and dies in Miami Beach on January 15, 1983, age 81. His obituaries describe him as a financial genius who built a gambling empire, as the mob's accountant who transformed organized crime from violent chaos into disciplined business. They mention Cuba, but usually as a footnote, one failed venture among many successes. The truth is that Cuba was Lansky's greatest achievement and his greatest failure. He built an empire more ambitious than any previous mob operation, and he watched it vanish in days. He never recovered from that loss, financially or psychologically. His final years are spent in a modest Miami apartment, his wealth depleted by legal fees and lost investments, his power gone, his legacy reduced to stories told by aging mobsters who remember when he was the smartest criminal in America. Santo Trafficante Jr. returns to Tampa and refocuses on domestic operations. He survives multiple federal investigations, including subpoenas to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 about alleged mob involvement in President Kennedy's murder. He invokes the Fifth Amendment, admitting nothing, revealing nothing. He dies on March 17, 1987, age 72, of natural causes. His obituary barely mentions Cuba, focusing instead on his Tampa operations. But those who knew him report that he never stopped talking about Havana, about the casinos he controlled, about the money he lost. Cuba haunted him until death. Fulgencio Batista lives in exile until 1973. He settles first in the Dominican Republic, then Portugal, finally Spain. He writes memoirs justifying his regime, claiming he modernized Cuba and was betrayed by American indifference to communist infiltration. He expresses no remorse about corruption or collaboration with the mob. He dies on August 6, 1973, age 72, in Spain. His body is eventually returned to Madrid for burial. Some Cuban exiles consider him a patriot who fought communism. Most historians judge him a corrupt dictator whose incompetence and brutality made Castro's revolution possible. Fidel Castro rules Cuba for 49 years, finally stepping aside in 2008 due to illness. He dies on November 25, 2016, age 90. His legacy is contested. Supporters praise him for resisting American imperialism, providing universal health care and education, and maintaining Cuban independence against enormous pressure. Critics condemn him for authoritarianism, economic mismanagement, and human rights abuses. But no one disputes that his revolution destroyed the mob's Cuban empire and ensured it could never return. The buildings remain, but the empire is gone. The casinos that once generated millions of dollars sit empty or repurposed. The hotels that hosted American celebrities now accommodate tourists seeking cheap Caribbean vacations. The nightclubs where Frank Sinatra performed are restaurants serving mediocre food to backpackers. The revolution destroyed not just the mob's operations, but the entire culture that sustained them. The corruption, the exploitation, the casual acceptance that some people's pleasure is built on other people's poverty. What can be learned from the mob's Cuban disaster? Several lessons emerge, some obvious, some subtle, all relevant to understanding how criminal empires rise and fall. First lesson: criminal enterprises built on political corruption are vulnerable to political change. The mob's Cuban operations depended entirely on Batista's protection. When Batista fell, the protection vanished. No amount of money invested, no relationships cultivated, no infrastructure built could survive the government's collapse. Criminal enterprises require stable political environments. When stability cannot be guaranteed, investments are gambling rather than business. Second lesson: short-term profits can obscure long-term risks. The casinos generated enormous returns for several years. The skim-enriched mob families across America. The immediate profitability made the operations appear successful. But this success was illusory because it depended on conditions that could not be sustained. Intelligent criminals and intelligent legitimate businesses evaluate not just current profits, but long-term sustainability. The mob failed this evaluation in Cuba, blinded by immediate returns to the fundamental instability underlying everything. Third lesson: exploitation generates resistance. The casinos enriched Americans while Cubans remained poor. This inequality was morally wrong, but it was also strategically stupid. It created a population that hated what the casinos represented, that viewed them as symbols of oppression, that celebrated their destruction. If the mob had operated more equitably, paying Cuban employees better wages, investing more in Cuban communities, sharing more profits, they might have built local support that could have sustained operations longer. Instead, they extracted maximum short-term profit and generated maximum long-term resentment. Fourth lesson: no empire is permanent. The mob believed their Cuban operations would endure indefinitely. They invested tens of millions of dollars on this assumption. They built elaborate infrastructure designed for decades of operation. They planned succession for when current operators retired. All of this planning assumed stability that did not exist. History teaches that empires fall. The only question is when. Criminals who ignore this lesson destroy themselves through overconfidence and failure to prepare for inevitable change. Fifth lesson: when disaster comes, it comes quickly. The mob's Cuban empire took a decade to build and disappeared in weeks. Between December 31, 1958 and January 15, 1959, 16 days, the entire operation collapsed. There was no gradual decline, no opportunity to adapt, no possibility of salvaging partial assets. The mob operators had no realistic evacuation plans because they never believed evacuation would be necessary. This failure of imagination, the assumption that current conditions will persist, is common among both criminals and legitimate enterprises. Those who survive prepare for scenarios they hope never occur. Sixth lesson: Lost money can be replaced, but lost reputation is permanent. The mob lost tens of millions of dollars in Cuba. This was painful but not fatal. Mob families continued operating, continued generating profits from domestic operations, eventually recovered financially. But the reputation damage was permanent. The Cuban disaster revealed that the mob was not infallible, that their strategic planning could fail catastrophically, that their intelligence and discipline could not overcome political realities. This revelation encouraged law enforcement to pursue them more aggressively and encouraged potential criminal recruits to question whether mob membership was worth the risks. Seventh lesson: nostalgia distorts history. The Cuban exiles who remember pre-revolutionary Havana with longing forget the poverty, the exploitation, the authoritarianism. They remember casinos and nightclubs, not the slums where most Cubans lived. This nostalgia is understandable. They lost their homes, their country, their past. But it is also dangerous, because it prevents honest assessment of why the revolution succeeded. The mob's empire was not a golden age. It was a brief period when a small group of criminals and corrupt officials enriched themselves while most Cubans suffered. Understanding this truth is essential to understanding why it fell and why it deserved to fall. Today, the Riviera stands empty on the Malecon, its windows dark, its casino floor stripped of equipment, its swimming pool dry. Pigeons nest in the upper floors. Teenagers break in to explore, taking photographs of the decay, posting them on social media with captions about forgotten history and abandoned paradise. The Cuban government occasionally announces plans to renovate, but nothing happens. The building is too expensive to restore, too historically significant to demolish, so it remains in limbo, a 21-story monument to an empire that lasted less than a decade. From the penthouse where Meyer Lansky once stood watching fireworks, you can see the entire Malecon stretching along the waterfront. The view is still spectacular. The water still glitters in sunlight. But the energy is gone. The crowds that once packed the streets during New Year's Eve celebrations are smaller now. The city that once symbolized glamour and excitement is tired, worn, struggling under economic sanctions and governmental incompetence. Havana remains beautiful. The Spanish colonial architecture, the vintage American cars, the music that fills every street, these elements persist. But the particular magic that the mob created, the sense that anything was possible, that fortunes could be won or lost on a single roll of dice, that pleasure was available without limit for those who could pay, that magic vanished on January 1st, 1959, and never returned. The casinos are gone. The mobsters are dead. The empire they built exists only in photographs and memories that grow more distant each year. A new generation of Cubans has no memory of the casinos, knows the mob only from history books and Hollywood films, views the preserved hotels as curiosities rather than living history. And yet the story persists. It persists because it contains truth about ambition, about greed, about the seductive appeal of building something magnificent, regardless of its moral foundations. Meyer Lansky was a criminal who exploited corruption and enriched himself through gambling that destroyed families and perpetuated inequality. But he was also a visionary who recognized Cuba's potential before almost anyone else, who built infrastructure that transformed a city, who created something that, however briefly, was genuinely impressive. The mob's Cuban empire was wrong. It deserved to fall. The people who destroyed it were justified in their rage, even if the government they created failed to deliver the liberation it promised. But the empire's wrongness does not erase its existence or diminish its historical significance. For 7 years, from late 1952 when Batista seized power until January 1959 when he fled, the American Mafia controlled the most profitable gambling operations in the Western Hemisphere. They built hotels that were architectural marvels. They operated casinos that rivaled Las Vegas. They created an entertainment industry that employed thousands and attracted hundreds of thousands of tourists. They generated profits that enriched mob families across America. They proved that organized crime could operate internationally, could build infrastructure, could create something that appeared legitimate, even while remaining fundamentally criminal. And then it all ended, not gradually. Not through defeat in battle or successful prosecution, not through negotiation or compromise. It ended suddenly, completely, and permanently, when history turned against them. Meyer Lansky stood on that balcony on December 31st, 1958, watching fireworks, believing his empire was secure. Within hours, everything he built was gone. The casinos he designed, the relationships he cultivated, the money he invested, the decade of work. All of it vanished as if it had never existed. This is the ultimate lesson of the mob's Cuban disaster. Empires fall. Always. The only variables are when and how. Those who build empires believing they will endure are deluding themselves. Those who recognize impermanence and prepare accordingly have some chance of surviving the inevitable collapse. But those who believe their power is infinite, their position unassailable, their enemies incapable of victory, those people watch their empires burn and wonder how they never saw it coming. The fireworks over Havana Bay on December 31st, 1958, were the last celebration of the mob's Cuban empire. By dawn, it was over. By the end of January, it was already becoming history. By the end of 1959, it was a memory that seemed increasingly distant, increasingly unreal, increasingly like something from another world. The Riviera still stands, but it is empty. The National still operates, but without its casino. The Capri has been renovated, but the mob is gone. The empire that seemed permanent lasted 7 years. The buildings that housed it may stand for centuries more, monuments to an ambition that was magnificent and terrible, that transformed a city and corrupted it, that created something beautiful and something rotten, that rose so high and fell so completely that its story still echoes more than 60 years after the last roulette wheel stopped spinning and the final casino chips were swept from the tables and locked away forever. Meyer Lansky died believing he could have saved it, that with better planning or better luck or a different Cuban president, the empire might have survived. He was wrong. It was always going to fall. The only question was when. And when the moment came, when Batista fled and the revolutionaries marched into Havana, the empire that took 10 years to build disappeared in less than 2 weeks. Paradise was lost. It was never coming back. And somewhere in the ruins of the Hotel Riviera, in a penthouse that once belonged to the smartest criminal in America, pigeons nest and teenagers take photographs, and the wind from the Caribbean blows through broken windows where Meyer Lansky once stood watching fireworks and believing, however briefly, that what he had built would last forever. It didn't. It never does.